Hello, I'm Jeronim Capaldo, Research Fellow at the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University. I'm here with Dr. Lance Taylor, the Arnhold Professor Emeritus of Economics at the New School for Social Research and recipient of the 2015 Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. Thank you, Lance, for being with us today.
Well, thank you.
So, Lance, you have studied quite deeply the mainstream macroeconomic model and have found that there are some serious problems with it. Can you summarize it for us?
I can try. The main problem, I think, is, well, there's several problems. One is that the mainstream model is based principally on the notion of complete rationality and individual action of all participants in the economy. Whereas it's perfectly clear that if you look around you, that people are not fully rational and they also interact. So in that sense, the foundations themselves are pretty fragile. Now, if you do macroeconomics, which is what I mostly do, there are a number of sort of more specific problems. One, there's an assumption that the economy is fully employed. That is, current popular mainstream macroeconomists like Paul Krugman and Larry Summers sort of at the moment are turning somersaults because they realize that everybody hasn't been fully employed for the last 7 or 8 years. And they try very hard to come up with explanations for that, which are not fully convincing. So full employment is one problem that mainstream macro has traditionally faced. Another problem has been essentially not much attention being paid to income distribution. That is, the standard mainstream growth model essentially says that people are paid what they deserve because they're being paid the value of their marginal product. Now, what a marginal product means is extremely obscure. And if you look at, say, an executive, a CEO of a big company, he or she is likely to be having something like an 8-figure income. The same people 20 years ago had something like incomes in the low 7 figures. They're probably no better or worse at running their companies now than they were back then, but there's been such a jump in income payments that there has to have been a change in social arrangements. And again, that's not something that the mainstream model tends to accept.
Okay, thank you. And so if we wanted to, as you've done, propose a better macroeconomic model, what would that look like?
Well, I think one thing you have to look at, you have to recognize, of course, as I mentioned, that unemployment is a major possibility and, in fact, a probability for lots of people in the economy. It seems to me that looking at how employment goes together with income distribution, mainly between profits and wages, but also between, let's say, wages and independent proprietors and also recipients of capital gains who have been getting a lot of money recently. You have to look at distribution and how that interacts with the level of aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is basically what determines the level of economic activity and the level of employment. Whereas in the mainstream view, the general belief is that there is simply full employment, as I said, miraculously.
Okay. And in more recent years, you've studied climate change and its consequences on the economy. And what are the consequences of climate change on the economy?
Well, it's a better question, what will be the implications of climate change for the economy? I mean, we're just now entering into really feeling the impacts of global warming and climate change with the Antarctic ice sheets melting and big holes opening up in the tundra in Siberia. So these are just manifestations of a general process. And the question is, how will the economy and the society more generally respond to these pressures? I mean, one thing, again, is that there's very likely to be unemployment as a consequence of climate change. And the mainstream models, Bill Nordhaus and Nick Stern, people like that, most of their modeling just doesn't take into account the possibility of unemployment. A second thing that's going to be quite devastating is not too strong a word in terms of the society, is that if humanity is going to survive after climate change, essentially you have to have a stationary economy.
Uh-huh. What does that look like?
Well, I don't know what it looks like. But that's got to be a major transition. That is, for the last 200 years, the whole emphasis has been on economic growth and how rising productivity can feed into economic growth, and the rising tide lifts all boats and that kind of thing. And that's simply going to be impossible.
I see. And so, because you're talking about the rising tide, clearly distribution or functional inequality, if we want to use another term, figures in the picture there.
Yeah, it has to. Yeah, and it's hard enough to deal with when you have the rising tide, when there is actually economic growth going on. But with no economic growth, which has to happen. I mean, if you're going to stop emitting greenhouse gas, you've got to stop growing, and that's going to create major changes in the way the system operates.
I see. And so, and whereas the other models of climate change and the economy that are based on a more mainstream approach, in fact, are not going to take this into account.
They can't take it into account because they just postulate that everybody's going to be fully employed. They can, in a way, take into account the stationarity that has to happen. They do that, but neither I nor the kind of models that I do or the kind of models that they do really can deal adequately with social implications, I would say.
And is the main social implication something like inequality, or?
Well, the main social implication is basically you're going to have a zero-sum game, and if somebody wins, somebody else is going to have to lose. And if in a growing economy, that's not the case.
Yeah.
As badly.
I see. Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.